Well, it's morning again here in Jerusalem at the King Solomon Hotel, and of course we have to begin our day somewhere. This time we're headed to Qumran. Now, Qumran is where the Essenes had a monastic community composed only of men as they attempted to escape all of the rigors and unholiness of common life and restore some sense of biblical purity to their lives. Well, the Essenes no longer exist, but they did one thing for us for which we're deeply grateful. They wrote things down. They acted as preserving scribes, and so many of the books of the Bible they wrote down, as well as some of their own rules, and they stored them in jars knowing that the Romans were coming and would destroy everything. And they rested there for almost 2,000 years until they were found, and we're so grateful to them because it proved again to us how old and how accurate the Word of God was. So we're going there today. After that we will go to Masada, we always do. And Masada isn't necessarily a biblical site, although it has certain biblical prophetic implications. And then of course the dip in the Dead Sea, but you'll not likely see that on this film. But go with us as we head for Qumran. In the day of Jesus, the land of Israel was ruled basically by, 3 or 4 groups. The largest of those religious political groups would have been the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees would have, perhaps in our vernacular, been called the back to the Bible bunch. They were right-wingers, they were conservatives, they were sort of the Republicans of their day. There was another group that was a little bit smaller in number than they, known as the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were the liberals. They didn't believe in miracles or in the resurrection or anything like that, and they were the group willing to sort of negotiate with Rome. We could say that maybe they were the Democrats of their day. There was another group known as the Zealots. Now, the Zealots were the radical activists. Whatever you have to do to throw off Rome, do it. In fact, some of those zealots, some of the more charismatic ones of them who would go out in the desert or go somewhere, gather a following to themselves. When they thought that following was large enough, they would declare themselves to be Messiah and say, now let's throw off Rome, I will empower you. And many, many, many Jews had lost their lives because of these zealot messiahs, which is probably one reason why when some recognized who Jesus was, he said to them, shh, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, because if the person isn't experiencing Jesus personally as the Messiah and all they hear is, hey, I found the Messiah, they'll likely say, oh boy, I wonder how many of us are going to die this time, And then I believe the Essenes probably had some influence, though they were the monastic group, some influence in Israeli life. But here was the problem. The Pharisees and the Sadducees would tend to be wealthy people. The Pharisees especially, and the Sadducees also, believed that the reason poor people were poor was because God didn't love them. He was unhappy with them. The reason they were rich, of course, was because the Pharisees, was because obviously they must be doing something right. God must love them. So they despised the poor. The Zealots despised the poor people of the land because they just wouldn't get up with some get up and go and throw off Rome, because they said if we could ever get them organized, we could do it. So they despised the poor. Now, the Essenes were the more generous or charitable of the whole bunch, but even they had a little problem because those people out there just wouldn't get out here and live righteously, you see. It's hard to live righteously out among the crowd. Now, those 4 groups made up less than 10% of the population. The remainder of the population were the common people, the poor people of the land, the ones who heard Jesus gladly. Now the Pharisees are dead and gone, and they're not remembered for what they thought they would be remembered for. The Sadducees are dead and gone. They're not remembered for what they thought they would be remembered for. The Zealots are not remembered because they threw off Rome, not at all. They too, well, there are still Zealots in the world today, but the ones that were back then here or around are dead and gone and not remembered for what they thought they would be. The Essenes probably come closer to being remembered for what they thought they would be, and that they wanted to preserve the Word. What a marvelous thing. And to some degree, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did precisely that. And we have evidence of the sanctity and God's protection of the Word of God, that what we have today is exactly what they had back then. And the Bible has continued, protected by God, through the centuries. But the Essenes are dead and gone. They were a monastic group. Get away from all of the influences of the world. And so they despised those who were influenced by those things of the world. Now, Jesus comes along. And he has a different thing to say, a different approach to things entirely. It's interesting to me that the conservatives were Jesus' greatest enemies, the ones who went after him the most intensely, the Pharisees. But the Sadducees were close behind. And there's some speculation that Judas might have been a zealot who was thinking, I can force this man to show his power, to throw off Rome. If I can get him in a dangerous situation where he has to save his life, that'll force him to use his power, and we can throw off Rome. So maybe that's one of the theories. So it could be that Judas was a zealot. But Jesus comes along, and guess who hears him gladly? Why? He has an entirely different message from what the others are saying. He doesn't come just to protect the Word. He is the Word. And he is living out the very thing that the Word is about. And in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, we hear Jesus reading from Isaiah, which was preserved here, as you know. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. In other words, He has anointed me. In other words, He's saying, when He says this, I'm the Messiah. To preach, here's what He's anointed me to do. To preach the good news to the poor. Amazing. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, or the time when God is saying, you're in my favor, God is on your side. So it was an entirely different message. It wasn't a message of hostility to anyone except to those who would shut the door of the kingdom. But instead it was a message, and guess to whom? What kind of clientele is this anyway? Poor, brokenhearted, captives, blind, oppressed, those out of favor. It was an entirely different message. A message that would cause the poor people of the land to hear Him gladly. The same continues to be true. Whereas these other scenes and groups have died, Jesus continues. Their message is gone. The message of Jesus is not gone. It continues. Now, there are a lot of different misconceptions we have about what might be happening even now in the land that we are visiting. As we went through Jerusalem and you saw those dressed the way they were and the intensity of that wall, you may come to the conclusion that everybody in this country believes in God. The fact is, that's not true. The Holocaust and its aftermath really produced a nation of atheists. And the majority of this country would be sectarian or non-religiously practicing people. And so they have no real desire, except for cultural and maybe tourist reasons, to preserve a place like this. And Israel of today is really almost no different than the Israel of 3,000 years ago, or 3,500 or 200 years ago, or 2,500 or 700 years ago. It's still a land of great mixture. Now, what does that say to us? It says they're just like us. And when God chose them, He chose them just so He could show the depths of His grace and just how wonderful He is to people. He chose them, I think, so that He could say, now here's a group that will test me to the fullest. And if my mercy is true, they'll prove it. And folks, His mercies endure forever. But I want to tell you a Qumran story that you may not have ever heard before, because it's only a month old. I was in India a month ago, and on about the second page of one of the Hindu papers was an article whose headline says, "Scrolls prove Jesus was a woman." And here's the story. You've heard of Bhagwan, Sri Rajneesh, remember him? Came to Oregon, built the big commune there. Finally, he gets kicked out of there because he's doing all kinds of things that are illegal. Goes back to India. They don't want him, but he makes it there, dies, and his Rajneesh Puram, or whatever they called it, changes their name to Sosho. So if you ever see that word, Sosho, that's the old Rajneesh. Now, I didn't realize that until someone told me. I'm reading this article, and here's the story. They called a press conference at Sosho. Now, I thought, well, maybe that's a town or something. And even the newspaper, with a great skepticism, says, and this breathless lady, young lady, delivers the message that she had just been under the auspices of Harvard University, digging here in Qumran. They had found some additional scrolls, one of which revealed that Jesus was actually named Jessica, and that he was much more of a legalistic rather than a grace-filled teacher. And that the reason she knows this is because the Catholic Church, when they found out about this, was going to try to suppress this or perhaps steal the scroll. So she instead surreptitiously stole it in the middle of the night under the watchful eye of a proper authority, opened and unrolled the scroll. Now, you know, immediately you're thinking, now wait a minute, if they know what it said, why do they have to unroll it? But that's beside the point. In those auspices, she says, she unrolled the scroll and has discovered all of this, and here is the announcement, you know. And even the newspaper was skeptical of this, as was everybody else, because nothing seemed to fit. I'm sure that were this true, you would all have known it by now, you see. But here was an attempt to make Jesus different from what we believe. It's not the first attempt. Here's an attempt to give him, shall we say, a bad rap, that he wasn't who we thought he was. Many have tried to do that. When they stood before Pilate with Jesus, all of the testimony was negative. Jesus had no one speak in his defense. He did not speak in his defense. Only one speaking were the prosecution, and every bit of testimony was negative. But when it was all over, what did Pilate say? I find in him no fault at all. I'm convinced that it really doesn't matter what kind of testimony. If you can just get his name in front of everybody, he wins. I'm convinced that Jesus Christ Superstar, which was a negative approach to Jesus and viewed him through the eyes of Judas, was one of the things that started the Jesus movement. Because when you get his name up in front of people, people begin to think, okay, we know this is Hollywood. What was he really like? And they start searching out. Recently, there was a movie called The Last Temptation of Christ. Every review I read of it was negative. And there were many who picketed this, which is probably the secret of its success, because what I understand, it was a lousy movie that would have died at birth had it not been for those of us who picketed. But one interesting thing, a friend of mine said, I have a friend who said, I want to go see this movie and I know it's wrong. Would you go with me and tell me what's right? And I'm thinking, just get his name up there. And he wins, you see. And I thought then, as I found out about this article in that Indian newspaper, everyone is going to read that and they'll know, social? Come on, give me a break. But if they say that, then they're saying what they said is not true of Jesus. There's something that is true, though. What is it? What is it? And so somehow, even if it's negative, Jesus wins. Just get his name up there. Paul, if you recall in Philippians, he says, some preach Christ just to agitate me, make me jealous. Some preach Christ for personal gain. Now, you know, those are the kind of people I'm going to go after and maybe write articles to prove how bad they are. But Paul didn't do that. He said, thank God Christ is preached. Because he knew you get his name up there and he wins. He wins. So the living word, just by being known, wins. The written word, hid in a cave like that. How would these people have known that 20 centuries later, a group of people like us would rejoice in the knowledge that the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, and has remained? Thank God for the Essenes. Thank God for them. Thank God for the Word, written and living. Amen.